Blizzard today has released a whole bunch of information related to the next expansion. However, it is still too early to go and talk about the news they posted about the new dungeons, the new delves, the new raids, even the new housing system. Instead, we talk about something that will touch all players, and they will have to start thinking about what to do about this somewhat soon, which is the add-ons. The incoming purge of add-ons planned by Blizzard for the next expansion. As you know, many interactions and features of add-ons like boss mods, BigWigs or deadly boss mods, as well as WeakAuras, as well as Plater and any kind of nameplate add-ons will go and die at the beginning of the next expansion. Blizzard has announced already a couple of months ago features like incoming heals no longer being trackable, no tracking group abilities or other players' cooldowns, no tracking of specialized buffs or debuffs, as well as removing pretty much the visual customization of your nameplates, besides just the size of the bar and the font of the text. Everything else will be disabled. So if you have, like you see here in this random Mythic Plus key, things like OmniCD showing all of the available cooldowns of the players that you want to see, this will be disabled. If you see on the screen things like the debuffs on players, the buffs on players, someone activating an external or a defensive or even an offensive buff like Power Infusion, also disabled and untrackable in the next expansion. Same goes for nameplates. You see all of this goodness showing up in the nameplates, like even the cooldown of thrash mobs, the cooldown of the dangerous abilities of the thrash mobs that is attached to the nameplate, that's also gonna go away. Now, one of the first things Blizzard showed us was one of the examples of the new nameplate. What they highlighted was giving you basically a highlight for dangerous casts. So you have the normal cast being non-glowy and then the important cast with a glow. Now, you can already see, compared to what you're seeing in a Plater profile, how much bare bones this is compared to what you can customize in Plater. You can see that here in Plater you have the normal random thrash that doesn't really do anything and doesn't really cast anything dangerous is in red. Then you have casters being in light blue, and then you have the dangerous mob of the pack being purple. Then you also see the cooldowns of their abilities next to their frames. And Plater also gives you other options like being able to make the cast bar glow. You can also change the color of the cast bar. For example, if it's uninterruptible, it's gonna be gray. If it is interruptible, but your interrupt is on cooldown, it can be changed to be red. If it is interruptible and you have the interrupt available, it can be changed to yellow or to orange to make it more simple for you. So you can see already that even with the default UI addition, it is still a far cry from what you would be able to get from an actual customized add-on. Now, Blizzard also pointed out that the plan isn't to just continue to develop mechanics and trash mobs in Mythic Plus or encounters in Raids and Mythic Plus to be still as if you needed this many tools and this much info in your nameplates or in your add-ons. As they are saying, and as they said, the plan is to go hand in hand in making, essentially pruning the add-ons with less information, but also adjusting the encounters, adjusting the mobs to also have fewer of these things you need to keep track of. In their own words, removing the ability for add-ons to solve most encounter mechanics means that we can also take a different approach to the design of our encounters going forward. The goal is to still make essentially the game challenging, but not just being solved by how much info can you get from add-ons. The second thing they point out is the damage meters. This was the example they showed us about your damage meters and the options you can have and you can show in the meters. Again, this is another example of something that obviously you will be able to get in much more detail thanks to details, right? Details has a million different options you can show up. You also have a million different plugins you can have, as well as multiple different scripts you can run with details. You can also have plenty of other features like being able to check for example, right after a wipe, the summary. You can check who took the most damage from what, and also who took the most damage from which spell, for example, maybe something you're supposed to be dodging, as well as the damage. You can, for example, go imagine in a boss with important phases. For example, you don't much care about the overall damage on Saladar. You want to see about the add damage in P2. So you can simply choose the phase with the adds and check who was doing the most damage in the add phase, for example. That's also something that is very easily visible if you went on details. Even if you're a player, single player and not a raid leader, after a pull, you could be a Destro Warlock and wonder what you did different compared to the other Destro Warlock in your group, and immediately be able to check the difference in your damage versus the other player's damage, for example. So these are all things that are, again, much more easily customizable and visible in an add-on rather than what is Blizzard offering in their default UI. The next thing, this one is a bit better. This one is essentially the replacement for DBM and the replacement for BigWigs. So Blizzard is adding the alerts for your mechanics. Not just the alerts for the mechanics, but also a combat timeline. So seems like they opted away from a bar system and went for a still pretty popular nowadays timeline of mechanics. This will be cooked in every encounter. You will get to see when the things are coming. Seems like some of the dangerous things will also be already highlighted in the timeline by itself. You get to choose a few options, like if you want it horizontal or vertical, the icon direction, if you want spell names or just the icons. So you have a few options, as well as the actual warnings. This is similar to DBM or BigWigs. You want the normal warning, the emphasized larger warning, as well as the targeting warning of the encounter mechanics. Which obviously, again, it's gonna pale in comparison to something that BigWigs can do, right? Because if I were to choose a boss fight right now, make it Nexus King, right? You can choose, for starters, which abilities you want to check. Imagine you were trying to fight this and you were swarmed by all of these icons, when really only you cared about a couple of these, not just all of this list of things you don't really care about. Like in this fight, many or a lot of these bars you might not want to look at. You might not want them to clog your visual ability to remember things, because you don't really need to see them. You can just disable them by yourself. You also have the ability to choose, for example, if you want the message to be emphasized only if it's targeting you. For example, you could move the message bar to be here and the emphasized message bar to be here and much bigger, so that if it targets you, it shows up in here much larger, right? Or have the TTS voice announcer for the ability to have a countdown on the ability, to have a sound and change the sound. You could change the color in your bar if you want to make it stand out more, because it's a much more important ability. You can simply change it to be like green instead of red, so it will pop up more in your bars when it's going to show up, right? Obviously, all of this is way more customizable than just what, again, Blizzard is showing us over here in the customization options of this timeline. But where I feel like we will get more of a divide in the opinion of players is in the customization options of essentially your player suite, your entire package of essentially WeakAuras for your characters, with your abilities, the cooldowns of your abilities, your buffs, your defensives showing up, etc., etc. Everything that can pretty much show up in your WeakAuras, right? Blizzard is mentioning a few things they are improving about the personal resource display. Things like finally being able to actually choose which of the things you want to show. Something we complained about just now for bosses, being able to show or not show certain abilities. This should be the same thing for boss mechanics. Essentially, this should also pop up in here. you should have something that is unlikely to happen, another window that lets you choose the boss, and then shows up a series of abilities, and you get to choose whether or not you want to see them, kind of like this. If you want to show your essential cooldowns, if you want to move an essential cooldown to be considered a utility one, or if you want them to not show up altogether in your resource display. This is, of course, still extremely limiting, because at the end of the day, it's just going to be big icons for essential cooldowns and small icons for utility, right? But many players want to do more than that. They want to have different styles. For example, in my case, this might even look, somewhat similar to what Blizzard is planning, this Evoker one right here. But you have other things. For example, you have the bigger and more important raid cooldowns on the side. You have still, for example, the circle for your hover, for when you are allowed to cast while moving. You have utility at the bottom, the more important utility cooldowns at the top, that will also show up in here if you're using certain buffs or debuffs or whatever you want to show up. But on top of that, you have the ability to get even more free with WeakAuras, like for example for the raid one, creating an entire WeakAuras setup for your raid frames, so that when you open up your raid frames and you are in the raid, something like this, they will fit perfectly in your raid with your raid cooldowns, your utility, your defensives, your buffs, and then the important abilities for your raid, which is something that won't really be possible, at least from what we have seen so far, with this very, very simple, very straightforward cooldown setup for the default UI of Blizzard. And we know this is not the full intent, right? Even in their initial announcement about this, they pointed out that they know they're not going to be able to replace a fully in-depth customizable add-on that you have been using for years and tailored to your personal gameplay, etc., right? Their plan is to get a reasonable alternative, especially for 90+% of the player base that isn't trying to min-max their add-ons for combat the way some players are, and just to make it feel like it could be a reasonable substitute for a more advanced power user. Not to be an actual one-to-one contender, so not to be a contender to your WeakAuras or Plater or even Cell, because obviously it won't be. There just won't be enough customization to compete with those add-ons. At this point, we will just have to see just how much of it will be disabled, how much of it you will end up losing by going from the current freedom you have in add-ons to the release of the new expansion and the release also of the add-on restrictions. There are many things, for example, in WeakAuras that will become unavailable. There are still quite a few things that will work. Tracking your own buttons is still going to work, so pretty much all of this will still be able to work. But other, perhaps a bit more complicated things won't be, even possibly just something like being able to track this trinket going on players, so I know who to click on to gain the buff. Right, this already might not be nearly as easily to remain in the next expansion, as well as many other features related to tracking buffs and tracking debuffs, as we mentioned, things like OmniCD, tracking defensives, externals, tracking even offensive CDs, being in the raid and being able to track all these kind of things the way you want in a player's frames might not be nearly as easily trackable. I think the initial offer of the UI improvements we have just seen would be good if it was just implemented by itself. So if Blizzard just came out and said, okay, this is all the things that we will add by default in the default UI. We're not going to change the add-ons, you can still use your add-ons, but then you're also adding all of this by default. So the default UI still won't look like it's 2005, but it will just be more advanced, so it's not going to feel nearly as ancient if you won't play with add-ons. But pairing these additions with the removal of the functionality of many add-ons is where players might have more issues with. One of the issues players seem to be more afraid of right now is things like, for example, having to go in Mythic Plus and not being able to see who has defensives available, who has even currently used a defensive. Imagine you're a healer, a mechanic is about to hit very hard 2 players. Let's have a classic, the first boss in Cinderbrew Meadery, right? Normally, right now, you just have OmniCD, you have your cell, you can just go on cell, you can go in indicators, you can go in externals plus defensives and make them show up. So if you were a healer and you had 2 players with a big debuff, you saw 1 player using anti-magic shell, so you're like, okay, I'm just gonna use my defensive, my external on the other player. Simple. Meanwhile, now, with this change, you wouldn't be able to see it. That's what is worrying more, especially Mythic Plus players, together with the change to the nameplates. Many of the functionalities of Plater going away, right? Obviously, when you go from these amount of options, including adding particular scripts, if you want to, things like fixate on you or hiding nameplates of small guys that are unimportant or targeting a very particular dangerous mob a different color if you want, pandemic glow for refreshing your dots, using stops on particular enemies if you want to, as well as different mods, different possible blacklisting or customizing of different spells if you want to change them, if you want to change the audio or the color of the bars of one particular cast you want to check. Just one, right? For example, the Dark Fuse Blood Warper with the Warp Blood in Floodgate, and you just want to essentially pretty much make it more visible that you want to deal with this guy like healer. You're supposed to deal with that. You can do it in Plater, and then all of this will essentially go from this amount of customization to this. Here's your health bar, here's your cast, and when it's a dangerous cast, it becomes a bit more glowy, right? It's a bit of a jump going from one to the other. We will see as we get closer to the next expansion if we will get more customization than what is currently available, since right now these things are still very bare bones. And then of course we will also have to see what exactly Blizzard means with the going hand in hand with the demilitarization, the de-armament of the mechanics, going hand in hand with the add-ons. In their own words, if everything goes to plan, while will remain challenging, but the nature of that challenge will be less about managing the subtleties of class mechanics and add-ons, and more about collaborating with allies and interacting with encounters. So obviously, if you're removing all of these things, you don't want to see mechanics that require a cyclical and precise usage of defensives, of externals, very dangerous debuffs that require super quick reaction time, if you are also taking away the ability for players to notice, to see these things. Otherwise, it will just be twice as hard. You just have removed away our ability to solve that particular mechanic without actually changing that mechanic to also be easier. So we will see what will Blizzard do in the future. For now, this is what they have shown us as the next round of improvements to their default baseline UI in the next expansion. Many players are defaulting to a pessimistic outlook on this, as they are too afraid and just sad about losing their tinker tailored nice and tidy add-on setups, whether it is Plater or WeakAuras or Cell or OmniCD and all of the goodies that they can provide them, and not really trust Blizzard with coming up with a even half decent substitute for those add-ons. So we will see in the following months how much the improvements of Blizzard to the default UI will be compared to what we currently have in our own add-ons. But for today, on this Wednesday, this is what we have for this weekly reset. We're starting Our goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone else who has been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, the only positive thing about the Blizzard's damage meter is that the computing of the data will be server side. So maybe you will gain 5 FPS by using the default damage meter now.